Good morning, annyeonghaseyo. Thanks for coming to this Google for Mobile event. My name is Laurence Moroney. I've come here all the way from Seattle, where we speak really fast, so forgive me, translators, if I'm talking too fast. But I'd like to talk about next generation architectures and how we believe in Google we've been building technologies that will allow you to build next generation mobile apps and mobile sites. So in order to do this, I wanted to take a look at some of the trends that are going on in the industry. So let's just dive in and take a look at some of these things and where things are going. Where are we going in mobile applications? Where are we going in web apps? So the first of these, and the first attribute of a web app that we can talk about, is data. Now, all apps need data, of course, and some apps need data more than others. But it's very rare to have a valuable connected app that doesn't use data in some way. Now, I've been building applications for the web and building applications for mobile for a long time. And typically, when building applications, the data structure, the data architecture looks something like this. At the top, you have a database. And the database might be a SQL database in which you write SQL queries or stored procedures or things like that. In front of that, you'll have a service tier where parameters can get passed in to execute these queries, to execute these stored procedures. And the service tier will typically sanitize, clean these parameters to make sure that people aren't parsing bad things in. Then in front of that, there's typically an API tier. And this API tier is responsible for providing an interface between the service tier and the cloud so that your website or your mobile application can talk to the database, can write data, read data, update data, delete data, all that type of thing. Now, typically, if you want to have backups, you'll have a mirror architecture where you replicate this again. And then, if you're building an application that's going to scale upward, you're going to replicate it again and again and again. That's a lot of servers that you have to maintain. That's a lot of code that you have to write. And that's a lot of places where you have to maintain identity and security for your users. Now, we believe there's a better way. And that's what we call the Firebase real-time database. This is a NoSQL database that provides event-based updates, so it can be responsive, so you can build applications that run quickly. If you've used the old-style architecture I spoke about a moment ago, you had what we call a pull model, where if you wanted a data update, you had to ask the database for it, and you had to pull the data from that. With the real-time database in Firebase, it's an event-based model. So whenever something changes in the database, you get notified. You get updated quickly. It's fast and it's fluid is the goal behind it. The secondary goal behind it is that it's serverless. So think about that complex architecture that I just showed a moment ago. All those servers that you need to build, all those servers that you need to maintain, all those servers that you need to secure. The goal of the real-time database is to take all of that out of your hands, to make building your applications easier so that you can focus on the logic in your application. You can focus on what matters to your users instead of spending a lot of time and effort building a server infrastructure. And another benefit of this comes when you're a coder, when you want to write code. Again, if you think about all those tiers that I showed a moment ago, you're writing code in the database tier, you're writing code in the service tier, you're writing code in the API tier, and you're writing code on the mobile client. But when you use the real-time database approach, this is what your code looks like. Your code only runs on the client. You create an instance of a Firebase database, you create a reference to that, and in this case, for example, I have a plain old Java class for a stock portfolio that I've initialized it, and to write it to the database, I have that one line of code. And that one line of code manages everything for me of writing it, and in the Firebase console, it will look something like this. So as an application developer, I can now focus, instead of on all of the infrastructure that I need to be able to read, write, update data, I can actually just focus on my application itself. It's been made that simple. In the next session, by the way, after this one, Kat Fang is going to be building an application end-to-end, and she's going to be using the real-time database, and she's going to be getting really hands-on with some of the technologies that I'm just speaking about on a high level here. I recommend you hang around for it. It's a great session. Now, as well as storing data in a database like I've shown, many applications and many mobile applications need to store files on behalf of their users. And storing files on a server or storing files in the cloud can be a much more difficult task than it sounds. In order to be able to store files in the cloud, you need to have an edge cache so that people all over the world can access your files. If your application suddenly goes viral and you get millions more users than you expected, which is a great problem to have, you also need to be able to serve them those files without them being disconnected, without them losing access to those files because of your success. And that's the idea behind the elastic cloud and the dynamic scalability of the cloud. So by storing files in the cloud, you get this. But from a coder's perspective, I'm a coder, I like to write code, but I don't like to write too much code. And from a coder's perspective, when using something like Firebase Cloud Storage, the goal is that the amount of code I have to write is very, very small. And if you think about what happens when you store very large files, what happens if a user of yours is uploading a file to the cloud and they lose connectivity? Or if they're downloading a large file from the cloud and they lose connectivity? If I was storing that in my own infrastructure, I would have to write a lot of code to be able to handle this situation, to handle what we call handshaking, to manage the disconnected things so that you can reconnect and continue from your previous session. And again, the goal of what we've built with Firebase and Firebase Cloud Storage is to give this to you. Very simple coding model, and you get this very powerful back end, and you're not building your own server. Now, very often we say, I've given presentations like this, and people say, this is very nice. It's very nice to have code running in my mobile client, but sometimes there's code that I don't want my end users to be able to see. I don't want it in their device in case it could be reverse engineered, and I sometimes need to run code on my server. And that's where Cloud Functions for Firebase come in. So this is a suite of tools that you have so that events that happen inside of Firebase can cause functions to execute. You write these using JavaScript, and they run in the node.js environment. So for example, if a piece of data in my infrastructure changes, I can write a function to respond to that. If an analytics event changes, I can write a function in response to that. Or if an authentication event changes, I can write a function in response to that. And talking about authentication, if you remember the architecture I showed a moment ago with all of those tiers, that's the next part of this that I'd like to talk about, is that providing identity and providing security across all of these tiers can be very difficult. Also, users have much greater demands for security than they've ever had before. There's one piece of research that we've done inside of Google where we found that if you ask a user to sign up for your application, then each screen that you present that user in a sign-up loses 50% of your user base. So if 1,000 people come to your app and you give them a sign-up screen, 500 of them will go to the second screen, 250 will go to the third screen, 125 will go to the fourth screen. You lose your audience by half with each screen. So we've been trying to build an infrastructure to allow, if users want to sign up for your application, to make that as quick, as painless, and as easy as possible. And the second trend that users have told us, and maybe they've told you too, is that they usually don't want to sign up for your application if they can use identity that they already own. If they have identity on sites like Facebook, or Twitter, or GitHub, or of course Google, that they want to be able to sign in with those credentials, and not sign up again with another new credential to use your application. And that's why we've built Firebase Auth the way that we've done. Firebase Auth is a technology which is it's free of charge to use if you're using email password authentication, Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, those that I've mentioned, or if you integrate it with your existing auth system. The only time you'll ever be charged for using Firebase Auth is if you're using phone number authentication, because phone number authentication requires sending an SMS. But the cost for that is very low, and on the entry level, you get, I believe it's 10,000 of them for free per month. And then another part of authentication that we've learned from users that they really love to have is what we call anonymous authentication. An anonymous authentication, what this will do is it will provide security on data in your Firebase infrastructure to users who are not yet signed in, with the idea being that you can give users access to some of your infrastructure before they sign up for your application. And as a result, they can test your application and they can see what it's like, and they can still have security applied to what they do before they sign up for your application. And then once they see that your application is something that they want to use because they've had access to the data inside of your application, then they're much more likely to sign up for that application. And you're not going to lose half of them with every screen. And that's the goal behind Firebase Authentication. Now, having an app that can adapt to your users' needs is the next part of a next generation architecture. So it's very common that you'll see, and how many times do you open up your phone and you'll see there's an update for an application available. And sometimes an application will update itself several times a week. And I don't know about you, but those are the applications that I tend to stop using. I don't want to eat my precious bandwidth continually updating an application. So we've been working very hard to make applications be able to be responsive to users' needs by providing technologies to you as developers without constantly needing to update applications. And we've also been working very hard to give you the ability to understand what your users are doing and how your users are working, so that you can then understand what their needs are so that you can build them the best possible app. The first part of this is Google Analytics for Firebase. Now, Google Analytics for Firebase is one of my favorite parts of Firebase, and for two reasons. Number one, it's completely free to use, and number two, you can get most of analytics without writing any code. All you have to do is use Firebase in your application, and you get all of this great wealth of data for free that you can then use to intelligently determine how people are using your application. And in the session at 12 o'clock, I'm going to be talking about growth hacking and how to do growth hacking based on Google Analytics for Firebase to be able to grow your app. I'd strongly recommend come take a look at it. I'll go into a lot more details then. Cloud messaging is one of the attributes of an application that to me is very important. There are lots of people who will provide real-time messaging services to you, but I think cloud messaging is a great one for two reasons. Number one, it's free. Actually, for three reasons. Number one, it's free. Number two, it's built on Google's world-class infrastructure, where we send over 1 trillion messages per week, and of those messages, 98% of them are received in 500 milliseconds or less. So if you do want to use a messaging framework or a messaging infrastructure, that type of reliability is very important. But even more important than that is the ability to send the right message to the right person at the right time. All too often, you'll take out your phone and an app has sent you notifications that you don't care about. And those notifications are the kind of thing that will turn you off using an app. So we've designed cloud messaging very carefully to allow you, based on the analytics that you've gained from your users, to pick the right audience that you're going to send your users to. That you're going to send messages to those users. And this includes, as I've mentioned, audiences from analytics that you can define to send messages to, but also something that we call topics. So let me give an example of where these are different from each other. Say I'm in Korea at the moment, one of my favorite places in the world to visit. I love coming here. And Seoul is a big city that has a lot of traffic. And if you were to build an application that was to tell me the traffic conditions in Seoul, I only really want to know the traffic conditions in Seoul maybe 2 or 3 times a year, because that's the only time I'm in Seoul. You live in Seoul, you probably want to know it every day. But I only want to know it 2 or 3 times a year. So the idea here would be, if you were building an application for the traffic conditions in Seoul, if you created a topic in that application for the traffic conditions in Seoul and sent messages only to that topic, then I, as a visitor, would only receive those messages at the times that I'm in Seoul, where you would receive them almost every day, because you want to know the traffic conditions in the city that you live in. And that's the idea behind topics. That's slightly different from analytics, where an analytics audience, for example, I could define for a Korean audience, I could define people who are presently in Korea or people who speak Korean to be a Korea audience. And then I could send messages to that audience. And that doesn't apply to me, except maybe once or twice a year when I come to visit here and I want to see updates about the country I'm visiting. So that's some of the flexibility that I mentioned that you have with cloud messaging. And that's what makes a good messaging infrastructure important, because you can lose users by sending them the wrong message at the wrong time. You want to be able to send them the right message at the right time. Now, another way to drive updates to your users and drive engagement to your users without continually sending them updated applications is to be able to change your application on the fly. And technology in Firebase called Firebase Remote Config will provide this to you. Now, Firebase Remote Config, it takes a little bit of time to get used to it and to understand it and to see how powerful it is. But think about if you could have a variable from your application that lives in the cloud and is read from the cloud, but the contents of that variable are driven by analytics. And then you could adjust your application on the fly based on that variable. Let me give an example. If you build an e-commerce application and you want to give a standard discount to all of your users, that standard discount is probably 0%. You don't want to give everybody a discount or you'll lose money. But then you realize you don't have a very big market in Japan and you want more Japanese users. So you say, okay, for people in Japan, I'm going to give 5%. And then you realize from that, there's a massive growth market in the USA for your application, and you want to bring more USA users in, so you give them a discount of 10%. Now think about what the code for that would look like. You would have code that says, if user in Japan, then set discount equals 5. If user in USA, set discount equals 10. Else, set discount equals 0. And maybe you have 10 countries or 20 countries that you want to manage different discounts for. That's a lot of code that you would have to write and ship with your application. But follow this story. You've now shipped your application, you've launched it in the USA, and you've got many, many, many users because of Gangnam Style, people in the USA suddenly got interested in Korean culture, and they're downloading your application, and you're giving 10 million people a 10% discount, and you realize you're losing a lot of money. How would you usually change that? You'd recompile your application and ship a new version to get rid of that discount. That's the goal behind remote config in Firebase. Instead of you having that data in your application, you have that variable in the cloud. You have that variable inside of Firebase. And then with analytics, you say, if the users, you create an audience for people in the USA, you'll create an audience for people in Korea, you create an audience for people in Japan, and you'll say, for the USA audience, set it to 10, for the Japanese audience, set it to 5, for the Korean audience, set it to 0, and whatever other countries you want to set it for. You've now hit this scenario where there's too many people taking advantage of the discount in the USA. Instead of you shipping a new version of the application, all you have to do is go to the Firebase console and say, for the USA audience, I'm going to give them a 1% discount. And you just change it there in the console, and the application dynamically receives the value from remote config, and you don't have to ship an update to the application to take advantage of it. So that's the goal behind remote configuration, and that's the type of flexibility that we're seeing people demanding out of the apps that they use. And that's the type of flexibility that now we as application developers need to be able to build and deliver to them. But in addition to all of this stuff that we have to build, we've also learned that the ability to have growth technologies built right into the platform that we use to build our applications is also vital. So we've been working on a number of technologies for growth. I'm going to talk about a few of them. One of them is dynamic links. Now, very often when you want to share an application with your friends through invites with your friends, you may have a conversation like this. I've been using this application, and there's a great recipe for bibimbap in this application, and I want to share it with you. Well, what do? You tell your friend to go to the Play Store, find this application. There's 500 recipe applications in there. Find one of them, download that one, navigate the menus, and then find the recipe. The idea behind dynamic links is that when I share something from within my application, the context of that is maintained even if the person I'm sharing with doesn't already have the application. So if in this scenario, if I'm sharing a recipe, now I share it with you, you do not have the application already installed. You will install the application, and then when you launch it, you'll be taken directly into that recipe. It reduces a lot of the friction of sharing. And friends help friends discover great content. Friends help friends discover great apps. So this dynamic links technology, together with Firebase invites, where it's a widget that you can drop into your application that has a lot of intelligence about who you want to share the application with. So if you imagine as a developer, you touch a share button in an app. What do you as a developer have to do? Well, you have to call up the contact list of people that you want to share with. What does that contact list look like? At least in English, the friends whose name begin with A are at the top, and the friends whose name begin with Z are at the bottom. The average user in the United States, at least, has 300 friends in their address book. My name begins with M, so if you were to share with me, I'd be about halfway down, and you'd have to fish through 150 people before you'd find me. So the goal, what we've been trying to do with Firebase, is to bring a lot of intelligence to that. There's machine intelligence and AI in the background that helps sort your contact list intelligently and gives suggestions that have been intelligently decided. So when your user touches the share button, if they're using Firebase invites, it's going to give them a list of suggested users based on the people that they interface with a lot, the people who have similar apps to the ones that you're sharing, the people that you've shared with in the past and installed it, all those type of things. Again, greatly reducing the friction and allowing you to grow your app. Again, I'll be talking about this a little bit more in 1 hour in the growth hacking session. Come take a look and I'll show you what it looks like. Another one of the growth technologies that's available to you is what we call app indexing. And this is built on something that people do every single day on their device, is they search. So does it not make sense to you that if they've taken the time and effort to install your application on their device, that when they're searching for content that your application already provides, that content, instead of being given to them in a set of links to websites, will actually be a link to your application so they can launch and view the content in your application. And that's the goal behind what we call Firebase app indexing. So going back to my recipe example from a moment ago, if you have built an application with lots of recipes for great food, and then people are searching for a recipe, they've probably installed your application once upon a time, they've probably forgotten about it. Many applications are used only once. And then while they're using the Google search tool on their phone, if they're searching for a recipe, then the idea is they will launch that recipe directly from search. And they re-engage with your app and they rediscover your app. And that allows your app to continue growing. If they're continuing to use it, they're continuing to share it with their friends. They're continuing to talk about it. They're not forgetting about it. So this is what we call Firebase. And it's our vision for building these next generation mobile web and mobile apps. It's a platform on which you can build these. Most of the technologies in here are free of charge for you to use. There are charges for some of them, and go to the website and you'll see. But for developing apps, we have the real-time database, authentication, cloud storage that I've spoken about. We also have services in there for really enriching the quality of your apps, understanding how they crash through crash reporting, understanding how they perform through performance monitoring, and testing them through something that we call Cloud Test Lab. And then in addition to that, growth hacking and the ability to grow your applications, we've learned, is something that's very important to all application developers. So we have this suite of technologies that you can use in your application for growing them. In the next session, immediately after this one, Kat's going to be showing many of the develop technologies, and she's going to be building an application here on stage. And then I'll be back after that to talk about strategies that you can use with the application that she's built for growth hacking that and for hacking your way to success. So with that, I just want to say, Kamsahamnida, thank you very much.